we've been talking a lot about how the pandemic and the consequences of the pandemic might change society going forward. And my next guest, who's been on the program before, we always look forward to speaking with her, has a new piece out about that on the NBC News website. The piece is entitled America's Coronavirus Response Must Center Women, the Black Plague Proves Why. And we always get a certain uplift from a mention of the Black Plague. The author of this piece is our friend Lynn Parramore. Lynn is a cultural historian and author, and she joins us now. So first of all, Lynn, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be with you, Richard.
And it's great to have you. Now, rather than me summarize your piece, just briefly, we can get into details, but what's your thesis here?
Yeah, well, my thesis is that the crisis that we're currently facing is really throwing into relief some of the disparities in our society and in our economy. We are noticing that the gap between haves and have-nots is perhaps being emphasized. We're noticing particular problems that communities of color are having. And in this piece, I really focus on the challenges that women are facing and how this crisis might help us confront some of those issues and perhaps forge a better path going forward.
Okay, and what one of the key points here, I think, you're dating some of this historical shift in the past to the Black Plague, right? Medieval Europe, which I thought was interesting. It's not a connection I've made.
Well, I think a lot of us during the pandemic have been looking back into different historical periods where we faced a large health crisis. And one of the ones, I'm a student of literature, that jumps out at me is particularly the Black Death, which was an outbreak of the plague in 14th century Europe, in which a third of the population was just decimated. So during that period, there was a shortage of male laborers. And as a result of that, there was a need for employers to fill in the gaps by hiring women. And that had been something that was frowned upon prior to the Black Death. And indeed, even women as young as teenage women would be hired for jobs that they wouldn't have been considered for prior to this pandemic. And there was a loosening of restrictions on female roles. It had previously been seen as distasteful to imagine women participating in the markets, morally problematic, et cetera, et cetera. But after the Black Death, with more women emerging into the marketplace and participating in the economy, attitudes toward them began to change. And as women had money in their pockets, they had a little bargaining power when it came to things like marriage. They were able to marry a little bit later, thus have fewer children. And this was a real economic benefit to the whole family. You didn't have quite as many mouths to feed. You had more economic stability when you had fewer children. Certainly women dying in childbirth was a tremendous problem. And if you waited longer to have children, you could potentially get a positive health outcome from that. And eventually, a more egalitarian structure in the family began to emerge. Women had sort of more say. Men and women were setting up independent households. They had more money in their pockets because wages went up after the pandemic. And nuclear families really emerged. You didn't have to go live in the home of your mother-in-law, as you still did in places like India or China or even the Middle East. And there's feminist scholars have argued that this really put Northern Europe on a very positive societal and economic path following this terrible tragedy. There was actually a silver lining, and you ended up getting that more egalitarian family structure, which was eventually reflected in more democratic forms of government. So it was a situation that ended up benefiting everyone in the long run, those societal changes and loosening up of rigid restrictions on women's roles and expectations.
So, and just for context, Lynn Parramore, I mean, obviously the Black Death had many, multiple times the fatalities anybody is anticipating for COVID-19. And, but it was an enormous dislocating event. As you were talking, I was trying to, think about its connection to the First and Second English Civil Wars and, all these other destabilizing factors. But in response, I think one of the theories that you put forward is that somehow it led to not only the changes you described, but changes that may have actually echoed on down to the present day, even though it was centuries ago. Is that fair? Also, that the sense that perhaps in Europe, gender roles are altered today, perhaps not what they need to be, but altered today from what they might have been had this never taken place.
Yes, I think there is a lot of evidence that points to that conclusion. For example, you can see, 200, 300, 400 years after the Black Death, the age of marriage for women in Northern Europe tended to be later than it was for women in sort of older, more established civilizations where the Black Death had not taken such a toll, such as, again, India and in China. And, so that effect, because it was such a cataclysmic societal and economic event, it did have apparently very long-lasting effects. And women in Northern Europe to this day actually have more freedom and economic and political opportunity than women in most parts of the world.
So let's just sort of experiment a little bit. And again, we're talking with Lynn Parramore, author and cultural historian, about whether we can reconfigure, and we'll reconfigure gender roles a little bit coming out of this pandemic. So let's play this out a little bit. Obviously, we're not likely to see the mass death of male workers as a result of this. Can you can we talk through a scenario where, given what we know about the range of possible outcomes here, this is actually something that results in a constructive reconfiguration of labor roles and gender roles in the home, anything else? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So just as the Black Death highlighted the danger posed to society when women were not able to fully participate in the economy, i.e., if women had been forced to stay in their prior roles inside the home, Northern Europe's economy arguably would not have recovered from that pandemic. Today, while it is true that we are not seeing deaths on the scale of something like the plague, we are seeing a crunch in how we have constructed women's roles vis-a-vis the home and the workplace. We do know that there is going to be probably a movement towards working from home more, working remotely, and this throws into relief the caregiving burdens in our society that are disproportionately placed on women. You may have had the experience, I know I have, of doing a video conference with coworkers. It tends to happen more often with female coworkers, where a child will come and sit on the lap, or perhaps an elderly parent will wander by in the background. And right. The matter is, the average non-paid in-home caregiver for an elderly person is a 49-year-old woman living with her, taking care of her mother, and working full-time while doing so. And the majority, 2/3 of paid home care workers are also female. So the face of caregiving in the home is really female in the United States. We have a lot of outdated policies that put a tremendous burden on mothers. For example, we have very unfair and outdated parental leave policies. Many companies and organizations still designate females as the primary caregiver, and by extension, males as secondary caregivers. And so men typically are not given as much time off. Sometimes, very often in the United States, women don't get any paid time off when they become mothers. We're really behind the rest of the world. And I think that this coronavirus crisis is really putting a spotlight on how unworkable these caregiving arrangements are going to be going forward. We really do need, in my opinion, a much more robust state support for childcare, for working families and working parents, for example. We need a stronger social safety net for women, and we need labor protections for women. If you look at how the United States compares to the rest of the world in gender parity, which comprises many of these issues, it's very disturbing. We rank, according to the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Report on Gender Parity, we rank 53rd in the world. We don't even reach the top third of nations when it comes to how women are treated, both by the legal system, their educational, political opportunities, etc. So this is a time that we might confront some of these things that have really been holding the United States back, and I think could hold us back from a recovery from COVID-19.
And again, we're talking with cultural historian and author Lynn Parramore, and I think I speak for and I'm Richard RJ Eskow, your host on the Zero Hour, and I think I speak for my guests as well as myself when I say we are not endorsing the level of death in the Black Death, that we are looking for opportunities for change, and as we minimize pain and suffering. And I think, Lynn, you also write a lot about economics as well as cultural history and the intersection of the two. And one of the interesting things about this, in a way, it's opposition or contrast to the Black Death, for example, or other plagues, is that no, maybe not. I'm trying to think it through. What we've got here is a sudden absence of any workers, right? We have workers, we have this workaround and the doing Zoom and other technologies from home, but we have living workers who can't work, and millions of them, tens of millions of them getting laid off. We have others who are trying to work from home or do workarounds. So we have a shortage of places for them to go. That's where the unemployment is coming from for men and women. So I'm wondering what a possible strategy is to say, in addition to acknowledging the need for a better caregiver infrastructure, in addition to obviously gender parity in pay and other benefits. Do we now see a situation where we should use this as an opportunity to understand the value and role of each working person in general, and how gender does or doesn't play into it? I'm not framing my question well, but maybe you get what I'm driving at. If not, I'll try again.
Well, absolutely. We are facing a situation in which all workers, particularly blue-collar workers and service industry workers, are being hit very, very hard. And as you say, many of them don't have a workplace to go to, or if they do have a workplace to go to, it's very difficult to make childcare arrangements when there's a shutdown. We have two choices when we face a crisis like this as a society. We can regress into the past and sort of double down on past role models, or we can be innovative and think of new ways of doing things. And the reason that the Black Death is an interesting case study is because really you had new social constructs emerging, new opportunities, not only for women, but for workers in general. They were in a better position in relationship to their, the owners of land after the pandemic, because there was this labor shortage. So men and women saw higher wages and had more bargaining power. Now, this time, what we've seen so far in terms of gender, in terms of working arrangements, if anything, you're seeing a lot of very prominent politicians, governors, and attorneys general throughout about a dozen states right now, trying to make it more difficult for women in their roles in the home and in the workplace. And I'm talking about those that are imposing draconian abortion bans and restrictions on top of those that had already been imposed in the last decade. We are seeing a scenario right now in this country that feels like it belongs to a different place in time. I am working on a piece for the Institute for New Economic Thinking, looking at research which shows what happens to women who are unable to get abortions, which is going to happen to many women during this pandemic, because there are states, Texas, Ohio, Oklahoma, they've made it so difficult for women to get abortions. They're having to travel hundreds of miles, which is very, very dangerous during a pandemic, both to themselves and others because of the contagion. It's also very dangerous to be delaying abortions for months at a time. Some states have said you can't get abortion while the crisis is happening at all. Other states have imposed arbitrary deadlines, like you can't get an abortion before June 15th. What this means, because of gestational limits, is that some women will not be able to get abortions at all. They will be forced to give birth. Now, this is a very dangerous situation from a health perspective and also from an economic perspective. Researchers have shown that women who are denied abortions have negative, not only short-term economic impacts. Abortions cost a lot of money. Many health insurance plans don't pay for them. You have to factor in the travel, taking time off from a job, arranging care for existing children. Many women won't be able to do it. They also have negative consequences years down the road. They are less likely to get better paying jobs than women who are able to plan their families. They have worse credit scores. They end up with higher debt loads, and there's harm done to their existing children with those minimized resources. Their existing children often suffer from slow developmental milestones like language expression. Now we're imposing, and when I say we, I mean as a country, we're allowing states in many parts of the South and other parts of the country to impose these restrictions at a time when economic hardship is already burdening women and their families. And this is not just going to affect women. It's going to affect their whole families and, by extension, the entire economy. I mean, you're really creating a health crisis within a health crisis and an economic crisis within an economic crisis.
And again, we're talking with cultural historian and author Lynn Parramore. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the 0 Hour. So, Lynn, let's talk about this from a cultural point of view, because for a moment, because I've seen the stories about the sudden tightening of the even further of the abortion controls by largely male politicians against women, and it's hard for me not to go to a place where it seems almost as if it's 18th century kind of American history stuff, where a plague is visited upon us, let us punish and control the women. I mean, I don't see another through line. I mean, there's nothing that says in logic, in reason, even in the political ideology of the right, that says the appropriate response to a pandemic from a planning or public health or even ideologically right-wing point of view is let's get tougher on abortion. The only way it doesn't seem like a non sequitur to me is our country's long and Europe's long and perhaps, and I guess the world's long tradition of responding to a fearful event by punishing and controlling women. Am I off base?
No, I think that is quite evident when you look at history. In fact, there is research that correlates the most severe outbreaks of witch hunting in Europe to periods of economic contraction, specifically related to things like the Little Ice Age, weather patterns in which crops were failing, and there was widespread economic distress. So the blame for those events was, in some cases, placed on women, and they were persecuted and murdered at times. This is a pattern that we've seen again and again and again. The impulse to exert control over women when very terrifying and uncertain things are happening in the world. It has a very long history, and particularly the control of women's bodies, as you see in these abortion restrictions, and these, the governors and attorneys general who are making the case that women should not have abortions during the crisis say that they want to preserve medical resources for the pandemic. So they're saying that they're trying to protect public health, but they know perfectly well that abortions are usually very relatively simple procedures. They can even be done remotely by taking medication, by telemedicine, if there weren't unnecessary restrictions against that. But what they are not acknowledging is, again, the tremendous hardship that this places not just on women, but their entire families, and how women who do not have access to family planning are more likely to fall into poverty. It's not to say that all of American poverty is a result of women not having reproductive health care, but it is a factor. It is certainly a factor. And then the sad thing is, it is a factor that is within our control. So it's a punishment not just of women, but of lower income people in general. And really, it's a punishment of our whole society at the end of the day, because women are needed in the workforce in the 21st century, and they cannot participate in it in any kind of meaningful way if they can't plan when they're going to have children. It simply doesn't work. It's this regressive tendency. Again, when you have a crisis, you got two paths. You can regress, or you can begin to think about a way forward that improves some of the problems that the pandemic is revealing. And unfortunately, we're seeing some regression. So I would like us to think more about how to make things better for women and their families, and by extension, the whole economy. Another way we could do that is by expanding Medicare, expanding Social Security, the things that we were hearing about from candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and hopefully we'll be hearing from more politicians. But those kinds of societal changes would be beneficial to everyone, but particularly women. Women sort of get shortchanged from Social Security because they live longer, and because many of them take time off from the workforce to have children and do caregiving responsibilities. And, more women fall into poverty from medical situations, et cetera, et cetera. So, providing a more robust social safety net, which it's pretty clear. I mean, this pandemic is really shining a spotlight on how insufficient and bloated and dysfunctional our healthcare system really is. I mean, we could make a decision to forge ahead and really work together to bring America into alignment with the rest of much of the world on these issues.
Or ahead of them. And that gets me to, I guess, the last, or at least the next theme of what I wanted to talk about, Lynn Parramore, which is, for example, in the first hour of this program, I brought up in an economic conversation, Rosie the Riveter and the kind of sense of purpose that people had in World War II and how that affected women a little bit, or somewhat a lot. I've been thinking as you've been talking about a kind of overarching, I would almost call it campaign theme for all of this, right? Which is there a way, there are a lot of policy things we need to do regarding the workforce, regarding benefits, regarding Social Security and so on. We need to recognize caregiving in Social Security benefits. We need to make sure that single parents who are overwhelmingly mothers don't have their shifts changed on them, day by day by a fast food restaurant. I mean, a million things, all of which are enormously important, paid family leave and the things you've mentioned. But I feel as if we also need a sort of a higher purpose theme that says, but I love your thoughts on it, that says, let's use this moment to understand what we need to do about gender roles, about the home, about what everybody has to contribute to individual and collective growth and fulfillment, to make a positive message that says, this is the world we are glimpsing through the difficulty we have now. This is what it could look like. This is why it would be more beautiful than the world we live in now, and how we get there. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. The kind of reconfiguration that I would like to see really acknowledges that all of our human potential is needed, both in a crisis and, in normal times when we want a well-functioning society and economy. Men are not just breadwinners; they are nurturers. Let us help them be nurturers and give them an opportunity to have parental leave and bond with their children, which gives them a connection to the processes of life and the cycles of nature that might make them more attuned to things like environmental crises. I mean, these things are all tied together. And by the same token, just as we need men in the home fulfilling their human caregiving and nurturing roles, we need women able to fully participate in the political sphere and the workforce and bring their innovative ideas and their talents. We need everyone to be able to share their full human potential in our society. And if we're inhibiting people from doing that, we really are regressing, and we're going to break down as a society. And I think how we respond to the situation in the home and its relationship to the market and sort of the realm of the state, it's going to be very telling in terms of how we go forward on some of these huge issues that we face. I mean, I would say the two big ones are inequality, economic inequality, wealth and income inequality, and climate change. I mean, if we don't see that the root of some of those problems really begins in how we bring up our children, how we shape the roles, the gender roles of little boys and little girls. We're not, until we understand how important it is to create a more egalitarian situation, I think we're really going to doom ourselves. But by the same token, if we can really take a moment to understand how our problematic gender roles have contributed to this crisis and could hold us back in our recovery, if we can really look at that, we have an opportunity for some positive reconfiguration.
And a last thought about that I'd love to get your reaction on. So this pandemic has sort of put everybody back in their homes, right? I mean, we're all largely sheltering in place at home. arguably, North American society, is the most home-centered nation on earth. I don't know if you agree with that, but I mean, I think even more so than Europe. I mean, it has the homesteader culture, the Western frontier culture. Even if people don't come from the frontier, we don't have the tradition of the commons that Europe and Great Britain had, and so on. So we are a home-centered culture. We've been driven into our homes. Is there any way maybe to pivot this home-centric moment for the kind of change you describe?
I think so. And I think one of the things is to recognize what you just said, how important the home actually is. If you look at the work of economists and political scientists, for example, over the past century or even more, you'll see this strange absence of the home and the family. Discussions about how society should be organized and how resources should be divided, et cetera, et cetera. You'll hear a lot of discussions of the marketplace, the market, and the state, but somehow the home and the family is pushed aside. And I think that is really a blind spot. We need to understand that the home and family is actually central. I think feminists have been very good about making that point. The personal is political, for example, is a feminist slogan we're all familiar with. But we really have been a little clueless on this front. And I think, again, the coronavirus is really showing us how these realms are so deeply intertwined. I mean, you just can't ignore it when you're sitting at your kitchen table doing your work, conducting your work, if you're lucky enough to be able to do so and to have a job right now. And I think going forward, we're going to see some changes in the way work is done. And we are going to see, I don't think we're going to go back to a time when people are going to be crowded into, open plan offices and so on. I mean, there are going to be more people working remotely in the future. And so how we configure this relationship between the home and the rest of the world is going to be very significant. And again, we really do need to have a situation in which childcare is not solely the burden of individual families and disproportionately the burden of women. I mean, this has to be a collective program. It has to be something that the state is involved in a very robust fashion, the way it is in many other countries.
Well, it's a fascinating historical moment. We mourn the tragedies, but we try to mine it for every opportunity for constructive growth we can. So Lynn Parramore, cultural historian and author. The article is entitled America's Coronavirus Must Center Women, the Black Plague Proves Why. It's at nbcnews.com. Thanks for writing it. And as always, Lynn, thanks for coming on the program.
I'm so glad to be with you, and stay well.